All right, this video is about how I have Blender set up to use millimeters. It just made my workflow going to my 3D printers a little bit easier. So the issue I had with Blender initially was that by default, it's set up to use meters. And I could scale my models down, but when I needed things to be specific dimensions, it did make it a little bit more challenging. So I just found it easier to have it set up to use millimeters right from the start. All right, so let's go into Blender and I'll show you the settings I use. Okay, so I'm here in Blender and there's really only a few settings we need to change in order to make it work with millimeters. I'm just going to select the cube, and then I'm going to bring up my information window by pressing N on my keyboard. So we can see the default is 2 meters. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to change the way this is represented to use millimeters. And then we're also going to change the scale of this. I don't want the cube to be 2 meters. I'm going to want it to be 2 millimeters. So that's what we're going to set up. All right. So if we go to the right and we go down to Scene Properties, select that, and then go and expand Units. So the units in the length dropdown, you can see it's set to meters. I'm going to change that to millimeters. And now if we go back to the dimensions in our information tab, we can see it's now 2000 millimeters. So that's great. Now we've got it represented as millimeters, but the cube size is still way too large to use with any of my printers. So I'm going to scale that down to 2 millimeters. In the same area on the scene properties, go to unit scale. So it's set to 1. So since it's 1,000th of a meter, let's type in 0.001. Hit enter. Now, if we go to dimensions, we can see that it's 2 millimeters. But the one thing that we found that you see is now that the grid itself is scaled, the cube is so far down. So we want to fix that. So in order to fix the grid, go up to overlays, to this drop down up in the upper right, bring that down and find scale. So in this scale, it's also set to 1. So we're going to set it to the same thing of 0.001. And now when we do that, now the grid is back to where it was. All right, so now this is all set up to use millimeters. It's really nothing more than that. The one thing though is if you are always going to use millimeters like I do, instead of having to reset this every time you start up a project, you could save this as your startup file. And you can do that by just going to File, Defaults, and Save Startup File. And it'll ask you to save it twice. And then every time you start up Blender, however you have your environment set up, whether you have a camera, a light, the cube, all these settings will be saved. So the next time you start up a project, all these settings will come back. Okay, so there are a number of add-ins that I use for 3D printing. So we're going to go over those real quick right now. All right, so the first add-on we're going to use is the 3D Print Toolbox. And I use this to check my models before bringing it into my slicer. So to get to that add-on, we go to Edit, Preferences, and then in Preferences, go to Add-ons. And then in the search bar, we type in 3D, I think it's dash, 3D Print Toolbox. Enable that. Once you have that enabled, you should see 3D print over in your information window. So if we select that, under checks, there are a number of individual checks and you can set all these different properties accordingly. So the first thing we would do is, what I would do when I check any of this stuff is I would go into edit mode. And once I'm in edit mode, I usually just do check all. And the reason why I go into edit mode, along with one, it'll just check everything. And then second is it'll actually highlight some of the issues. So right now it's saying I have one overhang face. And this, an overhang face is really just going to let us know that we might need supports. And if I select this, notice now the cube itself got deselected, but if we look on the bottom, it has the face that it is identified as an overhang face. Blender doesn't really know because this cube is really just floating in air. This really isn't an issue, and I would pretty much ignore this. But when we get into some of these other ones, it's a good way to be able to select them and identify some issues before bringing it into the slicer. Okay, so there are a few other add-ons, but they're not specific to 3D printing, except for one that I use all the time, especially for functional models. So let's check that out now. Okay, so we're going to go back to the preferences window. We're going to go to add-ons, and we're going to look for add mesh and look for extra objects. Enable extra objects. And once you do that, that will enable us in the Add Mesh menu. Blender gives, by default, everything from plane down through monkey. But Rock Generator down, you need to select that extra objects, and it gives you these options here. All right, the one that I use all the time, let's get rid of these, is if I go to Mesh, Single Vert, Add Single Vert. And what this does is it gives me a single vertex. And when I do functional models, I use this all the time. This way I can extrude it specific dimensions, say, I don't know, 2 millimeters. I just typed in 2 on my keyboard and it brought that out. I can then go and extrude this, say another 2 millimeters. So I can do things like that. So I tend to use this quite a bit. Okay, so those are the things that I use to set up Blender to make it a bit easier to do my 3D prints. I hope you found this helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.